Oh, wow. I'm feeling slightly overwhelmed. I will I will be honest. Hello, everyone. So I won't be able to hear you because obviously you are muted. So please stay muted for the sake of just a little bit of coherence. Although I have to admit, I do love to hear background noises, so occasionally in such meetings, especially dogs and cats and domestic squabbles. Those are my favorite, but I don't think we can afford to have those. I must also apologize because I live very close to a train station, so you are likely to hear train noises occasionally, but I will try to remain muted if I don't have to speak. So, hello, I think people are still coming in. So I'm not sure, Patricia, I'll take some direction from you whether we should start or wait a minute or two.
Pindi, I think you should open now to everybody and welcome them as our moderator.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. And as I said, it's really is so exciting to see so many familiar faces and also faces of authors that I've read but I don't necessarily know, and also old friends from East London, from around the country, from abroad. Thank you so much. It really is a privilege to actually have people attend this event, particularly at a time where I'm sure for all of you, there's so many online events, there's so many webinars, so many people are zoomed out. My colleague Siraj Rasul was saying we're gonna be zombies soon. So thank you so much for taking the time and welcome to the special event. My name is Pindi Mnyaka. I'm a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of the Western Cape. I am also one of the contributors to this book that we are celebrating today, which it's right there, right behind me. I'm not sure if you can see it. Thanks, Patricia. And I also have a particular interest these days on coastal images pertaining to the Eastern Cape region in South Africa. And Gary's not here yet, but I just wanted to say to Gary and Patricia and to all the contributors, we made it. The book is finally here. It's real, it's concrete. So welcome to the celebratory event of our book, Ambivalent. And it's to me a very special book that brought together a number of both established and emerging scholars who had been working on visual material about and on the African continent, largely visual archival material that had not been written about or not written about extensively. And as one does, a number of us immersed ourselves in existing scholarship to find a vocabulary that would help us engage with these images. And at times we were met with real frustration and genuine dissatisfaction with the kinds of categories that seem to dominate, particularly if your own collection seemed to push you beyond such categories. So the notion of ambivalent became a productive one to allow us to write essays that spoke to these photographs' refusal for analytical closure and the necessity at times of holding conflicting viewpoints. So the book consists of 11 contributors, and I am proud of the fact that 9 of those contributors are based in African institutions, and the other 2 who are based in the US have also been affiliated with African University, which I believed has played a part in their respective contributions. So yes, this is a book about African photography by African scholars that challenges international scholarship on African photography to not only become aware of new work emerging here, but also different ways of engaging contemporary and historical photographic trends. So on our panel, we have a short panel and we have 3 speakers, and each of them have been given a few minutes. I'm gonna try to be strict to speak very briefly about the book. And then towards the end, we will open it up for questions and discussion. And I will introduce each panelist just before he or she speaks. And our very first speaker, our keynote speaker, is Professor Elizabeth Edwards. I hope she's still online. Oh, yes, she is. I see her. And it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Elizabeth Edwards, who is a most eminent scholar on photography, history, and anthropology. And she's currently an Andrew Mellon Visiting Professor at the V&A Research Institute in London. And she's also Professor Emeritus of Photographic History at the De Montfort University in Leicester. And there she was also the Director of Photographic History Research Center. And she's also worked as a curator of photographs at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and has also taught visual anthropology at the university, and has also taught at the University of Arts London. She's also worked as a vice president of the Royal Anthropological Institute in the UK, and she's also a fellow at the British Academy and was given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Society for Visual Anthropology. And she's published and edited several monographs and numerous peer-reviewed articles in journals, including in our very own journal, Chronos, in 2001. Unfortunately, I don't have a hard copy, it's in my office. And in that journal, very first special issue on visual history, which was edited by my colleagues, Patricia Hayes and Andrew Bank. So having her here for me at this event feels suspicious because later this year, the second special issue on visual history will come out, edited by Patricia and Iona Gilbert. And maybe Patricia will say something about that, maybe. But my first encounter with Elizabeth's work, if I may call you that, was many years ago in the small university library in East London, South Africa, at the University of Fort Hare. And it was the edited book, Anthropology and Photography. And the book was published in 1992. So when I first read it, I was more than 10 years late in my reading of it. But at the time, as an uninitiated reader on visual representations of Africans within the discipline of anthropology, and as someone living on that very continent that had been captured visually and in other ways quite heavily, the book provided a much needed vocabulary to both confirm my suspicions, but to also teach me to think about cultural archives and their relationship to not only institutions, but also how disciplines constitute such material. And I also found her writing enjoyable and compelling, which then led me to her other works such as Raw Histories, Materiality of Images, The Camera as Historian, and of course, numerous essays. And the one thing that's for me that was striking in all these texts, and I really struggled to find a way to kind of express this, is a kind of deceptive or concealed access to the work that would be easy to overlook if one reads her work quite quickly. And by that, I mean that in reading her work, you're not just simply encountering new content, which is often quite groundbreaking in many ways, but I think she has a way of getting the reader to think beyond what is there. I think fashioning a mode of reading that returns you to the text over and over, less because of subtext necessarily, but more so because the text itself is so generative and becomes a teacher that you return to when you're lost and then discover that they actually have more wisdom than you realized first time they taught you. And one of my favorite articles by her is in fact her Chronos paper called Photography and the Performance of History. And I'm not being biased in saying that. And even if I am being biased, so what? I've read it so many times. And as my own thinking has shifted from my doctoral research, where I was interested in the relationship between history and photography, and then later became interested in photography and performance, and now currently photography, fluidity, and access, I keep returning to the article, in fact. And throughout my intellectual trajectory, even though it was actually published in 2001. And so throughout my own intellectual journey, I have found that her writing has this malleable quality that allows you to pursue your own interests while remaining by your side and mentoring your own thought process. So I think in that way, her writing is both teacher and mentor. And before I start to sound like I'm about to propose marriage to her, let me just hand over to her for a few words. Thanks, then.
Well, thank you, Pindi. I'm almost speechless. It can only go downhill from here, I'm afraid. But hello, everyone. Greetings from a very wet Oxford in a dark, dank October day in the middle of a pandemic. However, it is an enormous honour and pleasure to be invited to say a few words at this celebration to mark the publication late last year of Ambivalent, Photography and Visibility in African History. It is a book that I read with increasing theoretical and empirical excitement. I actually had some trouble getting hold of it. I ordered it pretty promptly, I thought, but nonetheless, it was sold out at UK distributors. Sold out, that's very good for you. So I had to wait another 5 or 6 weeks to get my hands on it, but it was worth the wait. This is my copy. As you can see, it is covered in post-it stickers and scribbles and ticks and underlinings. I always find that the better the book, the more intense my desire to write all over it. Somehow I have to be part of it. Ambivalent is covered with scribbles. I could show you some, but you probably can't see them on Zoom, but every single essay is covered in scribbling. Now, I think this is a profoundly important volume. Not only does it come, as Pindi said, from fairly and squarely out of African scholarship, with a great and productive mix of scholars, approaches, topics, and concerns, it also vitally brings to the surface questions of what photographs do at the intersection with history. All the essays, in their different ways, raise methodological questions about what it is to write history with photographs, not simply as sources, we're all familiar with that, but as active players in the historical imagination, both the imaginations of historical actors and of us as historians. I think this double helix of effect is crucial to historical practice at that intersection, because it speaks to questions which underpin historical practice everywhere. Questions of immediacy, distance, time, and happening, for instance. These are the commonplaces of our historiographical endeavour. I have just, through lockdown, completed a manuscript looking at these very questions under the overarching question of what it is to write history in an age in which photographs exist. What does the very presence of photographs do to our historical landscape, do to our practice as historians, and the assumptions that underpin that practice? And in writing this, I found that so many of the essays in Ambivalent created a really productive think space for these issues. For instance, and it's invidious, I know, to single out individual essays because they are all so rich, but time is limited. You don't want me to go on all night. Willa Shigedwa's analysis of the 1978 Kasinga massacre was really helpful to me for thinking about how we use context in writing history. Too often when photographs intersect with history, context is reduced to an elaboration of what the photographs are of. Villa shows how carefully calibrated ideas of context can both destabilize and enrich historical narratives. Context as historiographical movement rather than containment, perhaps. Gary Minkley's essay on passbook photographs enlarged my thinking about presence. That is, photographs are markers of social being and experience in a way that goes beyond reductive notions of mere agency. At a personal level, I was delighted to see this concept of presence, which I applied to photographs some years ago, picked up and run with such effect. It actually works as an extended analytical frame, and I'm so pleased because Gary's actually picked it up and run with it. But such ideas in a different formulation also run through other essays, Pindi's own essays on beaches, always redolent spaces, and the ways in which the past prefigures futures in the temporal and spatial slippages that mark photographs. Or in the social photographic desires played out in the digital rendering of textiles in Nigeria, as Oke has explored, or the self-positionings and media manipulations of Boko Haram, as explored by George Agpo. These and all their colleagues' essays are important incisions in the field. All in different ways are addressing the experience of the past. Experience has been an increasingly important historical modality in recent years. We no longer ask just what happened and how, but what did it feel like for those who were there? What are the effective realms that might be excavated historically? Photographs have to be in the forefront of such deliberations. They move history into complex configurations, which perhaps we haven't noticed before. This brings me to another important contribution of Ambivalent as I see it. The introduction makes two very important and linked statements which frame the book and resonate through it. They stem from a statement in the very first paragraph that the so-called dark continent has its own histories of light. Apart from immediately placing the reader in the realm of the metaphorical possibility, again which resonates through the whole book, there are two important corollaries as I see it, and ones that make this so much more than simply a volume of robust essays on African history. First is the statement that the book addresses the distribution of theory, in that it resists homogenizing historiographies and theories of both history and photography. And then, second and crucially, that visual theory reaches a limit when it comes to Africa. These, for me, go to the heart of the pressing historiographical and methodological questions, because if we're going to take global photographies and global history seriously, which of course we all do, we need a refigured theoretical model, rather as Pindi was saying earlier in her introduction, one that is not necessarily based in the epistemic assumptions of Euro-American scholarship. The latter photographic analysis has been the product of certain readings, historical and philosophical positions, and anxieties. These foundations have established a theoretical position characterized by anxieties about truthfulness, the power and ethics of representation, certain notions of realism, the workings of the sign, the nature of the index, and the paradoxes and terrors of reproducibility, and so forth. But it's based in a very particular understanding of the ontology of the photograph. So it's necessary to ask in relation to history if these categories of photographic theory have paralyzed our analytical categories and our patterns of thinking, and have been resistant to other forms of photographic desire and photographic knowledge, has been resistant to taking them seriously. However, while the idea of a unified and linear photographic history has long been demolished, photographic theory and its hold on the analytical categories we use seems somewhat more tenacious. Its assumptions continue to weave through those multiple histories. But at root, there are political consequences to knowing in certain ways. And I feel this question lurks beneath so many of the essays here. What Ambivalent does is suggest another complex baseline, but one that challenges an inclusive photographic studies. But one of the challenges to an inclusive photographic studies is to go beyond the mainstream, not necessarily through internalizing the powerful critical structures that have shaped so much of the rhetoric around photographs, but to use the multiple concepts which emerge from the debates such as we are having here to supply a reinvigorated and enriched language and its associated categories. Such a move might, at least in part, provide a new and more accommodating discursive language, which takes seriously other ways of conceptualizing and analyzing photographs within the historical domain. As the great historian of the 18th century, Arlette Farge, has stated, and she's a historian of immense archival sensitivity, she says, there is nothing more than the choice of words to produce tremors and to break through the obvious. So here I don't merely mean a piling up of ever more examples and case studies, but a critical working through of our critical base, mindful of that distribution of theory. Because histories and their uses are not merely decorative additions to embellish an undisturbed set of assumptions, but rather they should challenge and destabilize those assumptions of what photographs do in people's lives, how they make histories, and how relationships with the past might be negotiated and understood. Perhaps it is time to reset the theoretical linkages of photography and history in ways that have a capacity to stop thinking in its tracks, unsettling what we think we know, and in favor of what we might not yet have imagined. I think Ambivalent stands to be part of that debate. When I got hold of my copy of Ambivalent, at last, in fact, I just completed an essay on this very topic of the assumed categories and resistance of photographic theory to thinking coming from different intellectual and historical traditions. Then Ambivalent arrived. I emailed my editor saying, stop, I want my essay back. I need to revise. I need to work these crucial points in. And I did. Do I get a prize for first citation? Because I think these are crucial issues for those of us working on the intersections of photographic and historical thinking. For these reasons and more, Ambivalent will, I believe, come to stand as a pivotal contribution to the field, read, I hope, way beyond the confines of African history, because it addresses core methodological and historiographical questions that should concern us all, wherever we are. Ambivalent indeed. And before I finish, I just want to say a couple of words about Ambivalent as a physical object. I think Ohio University Press have done a beautiful job, which complements the richness of the contents and really enables the photographs to work historically. It enables them to work as part of an argument. So I think an enormous debt of gratitude and congratulations is due to all of you who have made Ambivalent possible and made the workings of visual histories more ambivalent in the most productive of ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Edwards. As I said, we will have questions towards the end, so please note them down and just keep them for her. I see a hand from Warren.
No, that was just a thanks for the great paper that was just delivered.
Okay, all right, thanks very much then. Okay, we'll then move on to our next speaker, Okwuchukwu Nwafor, also a contributor to the volume. And okay, as he's more commonly known in these circles, is Professor of Art History at Nnamdi Azikiwe University, Nigeria. He completed his PhD in history at the University of the Western Cape in 2011 on photography and the spectacle of Ashibi in Lagos from the mid-20th century. And I believe this has been converted into a book called Ashibi, Dress, Fashion, Visual Culture, and Urban Cosmopolitanism. And this will come out in 2021 with the University of Michigan Press, so be on the lookout for that. We'll certainly have a book launch of some sort. He's also held a research fellowship at the University of Michigan, as well as the Vet Institute of Social and Economic Research. And he does quite cutting edge work on digital media and digital activism in Nigeria. And his contribution to this volume speaks to those interests. And he's multi-talented because he's also an artist. And if you are on Facebook, I would strongly encourage you to follow him for his incredibly witty and provocative commentary on Nigerian politics. So, okay, lovely to see you and a very, very warm welcome. And I will hand over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, Pindi, thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. As you have just said it, I want to speak first of all on my larger work before I narrow it down to the contribution in this volume. First, this work comes from my book project, and in that book, which is titled Aswebi, Dress, Fashion, Visual Culture, and Urban Cosmopolitanism in West Africa, I actually examined the rise of fashion practices in Lagos, Nigeria, since the 1960s. And through, I see Aswebi as a kind of fashion that has been deployed as a social uniform dressing and as an embodiment of the multiple aspects of cosmopolitan modernity in Nigeria. And again, in this book, I actually see fashion and photography as two inseparable aspects of cosmopolitan modernity, and which actually constituted themselves into a very powerful visual culture that Nigerians sought before and after independence in 1960, during the crisis, the economic crisis of the 1980s, and during the rise of radical printing technology and digital photography in the 21st century. And I actually examined how Asoebi dress have transformed an entire city's visual culture and stands as a formidable playground for exciting fashion experiences and experiments. Now, coming down to my contribution in this volume, which is titled Photographing Asoebi of Surfacism and Digitality. In this chapter, I actually looked at the relationship between cloth, self-fashioning, and digital photography in Nigeria. The conjunction between cloth, which on this note, I use Asoebi as that cloth, which is worn on the physical bodies, and then digital manipulation on virtual bodies. Both of them may represent a new form of sartorial elegance and cosmopolitan fashionability that one actually needs to investigate. The chapter examines how Asoebi fashion evokes a compelling form of visual culture in Nigeria, in which glamour is symbolically inscribed on the surfaces of photographs using digitally manipulative means. And this is where I employed the theoretical rubric of surface aesthetics to articulate how the seeming banalities and facets of late capitalist sensibilities are played out within a fusion of fashion and photography in urban Lagos. Now, from the 1960s, Asoebi, let us understand Asoebi in this context as a social uniformed dressing, which individuals wear to attend weddings and some social events in Nigeria. From the 1960s, Asoebi began to be redefined in line with the cultural and socio-economic changes that came with late global capitalism. Within Asoebi practice in the city of Lagos, meanings of friendship, solidarity, camaraderie, and wealth have undergone radical transformations as more people have migrated to the city, especially in Lagos, since after Nigeria's independence in 1960. Now, what have I done here? What I have done here is to borrow from Didier Gondola's suggestion, an idea of how the social and economic chaos that characterize the African city grafts itself onto the bodies of youth. From this perspective, getting shiny, digitally reconstructed bodies consummates the city dwellers' entry into the world of perfection. It provides the city dwellers with a symbolic satisfaction of abundance and prosperity, thus allowing them to reproduce a body that is an alternative metaphor for a chaotic social world. You realize that in a city like Lagos in Nigeria, most individuals, especially women, go out on weekends. And while coming back, they come back with beautiful photographs of themselves. And these are all what they get from some of those social events that they attend. Most women who attend social functions, social events in Lagos, bedeck themselves in dainty, shiny dresses, in posing for the camera amid the chaos of city life. The body is regenerated, it finds its redemption, and it lives and shines in the cult of digital manipulation. Now, the beautiful skin and shiny dresses together serve as the transformative surface required to engender a new being. They are a consummation of the technological invention of the digital software required to arrive at
Colleagues.
Now,
oh, okay.
Let me say something, surface aesthetics, that that the intersections of sartorial practice. Pindi? Okay. The intersections of sartorial practices with this new digital movement in Nigeria cannot be the art of dressing up for occasion. Central element in most social, or perhaps two things. The importance attached also influences their relationship with the digital medium. Now, I am interested in the contemporary fascination with the surface. How Nigerians, how Africans, and especially Nigerians are captivated by digital technology in such a way that urban culture is largely defined by surface affects, and how we can describe the experiences of modernity as being that of a surface condition. I see Nigerians' obsession with the surface as being revealed most clearly in fashion and photography in their everyday lives. The surface splendor can be seen as that which breeds revolutionary subjectivity. What I try as much as possible to do in my recent scholarship is to see how the everyday surface can be understood as a site for the projection of cultural, social, and political values. The interest which Nigerians have in technology is something that transforms the urban center in what I call cosmopolitan modernity. In the city of Lagos, you see how individuals come together to reconstitute the, to reconstitute the idea of fashion. How the concept of excess, the concept of putting on shiny dresses, and are being used to revisit our understanding of visual culture, to revisit our understanding of photography. How photographers, what I call popular photographers, and this is an idea that I explored in my book. Popular photographers all converge in the center where a social event is being organized, and how those popular photographers actually redefine in the people's our understanding of visual culture in the city. Pindi, I don't want to take a lot of much of our time, but most importantly, my work looks at the concept of materiality and immateriality of surface affects in our experiences of everyday lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone is taking notes and yeah, indeed, saving their questions. So our next panelist is Drew Thompson. And it's so wonderful to have Drew as a panelist because Drew and I completed our PhDs on photography at round about the same time. So we'd often meet at seminars and workshops in Cape Town and present chapters in progress in this field of visual history, which at the time had very few precedents to draw from as far as doctoral theses. And the same goes for Oka as well. So I think the three of us, I like to think of the three of us as sort of comrades in a way, who've come a very long way and actually have jobs. That's important, which I think is wonderful because it's important to be employable. So Drew Thompson is Associate Professor of Africana and Historical Studies at Bard College. He completed his PhD in history at the University of Minnesota with a dissertation called Aim, Focus, Shoot, Photographic Narratives of Imagination and Independence in Mozambique, 1960 to 1993. He has held several fellowships in the US, in Europe and Southern Africa, including amongst others, the Getty Foundation, Mellon Foundation, the Luso American Foundation, the Smithsonian Museum of African Art, and very importantly, the Center for Humanities Research at UWC. And I believe his upcoming manuscript is called Filtering Histories, the Photographic Bureaucracy in Mozambique, 1960 to the present. And I believe it will come out in 2021 with the University of Michigan Press. And having said that and said the same thing about, okay, I'm starting to feel like I've been wasting time. I should also have a manuscript coming out in 2021. So unfortunately I don't, but maybe soon. So Drew, very, very warm welcome and wonderful to see you again. So over to you for a few minutes.
Thank you, Pindi, and to everyone. In the history of art in Africa and the diaspora, photography is an important mode of representation. My engagement with the history of photography emerges out of a context of Portuguese-speaking Africa, more specifically the nation of Mozambique. In my research and writing on contemporary African and diaspora arts and social movements, I frequently refer back to an interview I conducted with the late Mozambican modernist painter Malangatana Ngwenya. One of Mozambique's most celebrated visual artists, Malangatana used muted colors to paint large-scale and figurative scenes of daily life in times of colonial upheaval. In the summer of 2008, I visited Malangatana at his studio near the airport in Maputo, the capital of Mozambique. I wanted to speak to him about the role of painting as a tool of anti-colonial resistance in Mozambique's liberation war against Portugal. After explaining my project, he responded by literally asking why I wanted to speak with him. He then explained that there were no paintbrushes and canvases at the time of colonialism and independence. His recommendation was to study photography and not the visual arts. And he advised that I speak with Ricardo Rangel, one of Mozambique's most prominent photojournalists. What Malangatana understood, and what I would soon learn, was that photography superseded painting as an artistic and social practice. In fact, the perception of the absence of paintbrushes and canvases determined, or at least clearly informed, cultural production and historical memory. My own interest in Mozambique's photographic archive stems from wanting to understand why there were cameras and not paintbrushes in times of Mozambique's colonial and independence periods. From Malangatana's purview, painting receded because in wartime, who can afford to prioritize the practice and value of bourgeoisie aesthetics? Indicative of this position, the liberation movement that came to power in 1975, Frelimo, elected to photograph Mozambique's new president, Samora Machel, rather than have an artist like Malangatana paint an official portrait. Malangatana put forward a perceptive argument about the relationship between ideology and economy that continues to inform my own study of how photography proliferates because of corporate, state, and non-state sponsorship. The co-editors of Ambivalent invited writers to challenge genre constructions like studio and commercial photography, which for far too long have dictated scholarship on photography, especially as it relates to the African continent. Koch Nam is another prominent Mozambican photographer of Chinese descent who worked alongside Rengel in the late 1950s at the photo laboratory Focus. Nam developed what he called, and I quote, shit photos, end quote, the images of white amateur Portuguese photographers. He would go on to define his practice and career as a press photographer in relation to his work at Focus and the shit photos that he developed. For my contribution to Ambivalent, I reappropriate this term, shit photos, in order to highlight and refer to a set of disregarded images of the Chinese populations in colonial Mozambique. The studio practices of these Chinese photographers, along with their clients' aesthetic preferences, paved the way for photo laboratories like the one where both Nam and Rengel worked. Thus, tracing how genres structure historical narratives in Mozambique suggests that processes of decolonization accompanied colonization. Furthermore, I propose that press and studio photography are quite interconnected in Mozambique. I am mindful that audiences, especially here in the United States, will engage the text Ambivalent at a moment of political and social unrest. This past summer, a police officer placed George Floyd in a chokehold and killed him. The 17-year-old Darnella Frazier witnessed the killing on her cell phone. The recording that resulted prompted millions of people to take to the streets in the name of, and I quote, Black lives, end quote. For many Black and brown people in the United States, there's nothing new and surprising about the image of George Floyd's killing. It's a constant part of life. In my estimation, Ambivalent reminds us that photography is a powerful tool of both surveillance and protest. Also, the book speaks to how populations continually identify and even embrace the racist and non-neutral impulses of photography as a means of self-representation, protest, and historical narration. As I seek to consider how Ambivalent might speak to this renewed spirit of pushing back on racial injustice in the United States, I am reminded that one of the first anti-apartheid boycott/divestment efforts in the United States involved Black workers at the Polaroid Corporation. In 1971, under guidance from Caroline Hunter and Ken Williams, Black workers organized at Polaroid's headquarters in protest of the company's business in South Africa, and they formed the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement, also known as the PRWM. The interests of the PRWM were not necessarily representative of the photographic economies available in South Africa, but taking a stand against Polaroid's business dealings in South Africa did offer the Black Polaroid workers possibilities to challenge inequality and seek better representation in their respective communities. Polaroid ended its business in South Africa in 1978, and there's evidence of the use of Polaroids in US prisons, a chilling reminder of how of the entanglement between the development of surveillance equipment and the profitability of colored film photography. While Ambivalent does not explicitly address scenes of police brutality, the book does question the following. 1, the universality of photography. 2, the medium's proliferation. And 3, the terminologies used to write histories of photography. The result is new pathways to map the genealogy of the picture in ways that foreground the experiences of Black makers and users of photography. Embedded throughout the book are the building blocks of a conceptual and methodological framework that make other forms of Blackness and diaspora more legible. Thank you.
Wonderful, Drew. And I love the fact that you actually kept to your time. So thank you so much for that. Our last speaker, I don't actually quite know how to introduce Patricia because I feel like we all know her in some shape or form. So, but for the sake of formality, let me introduce her officially. And as you all know, most of you know, Patricia is, of course, Professor of History at University of the Western Cape. And she holds the NRF Chair in Visual History and Theory at the Center for Humanities Research. And she's been instrumental in not only organizing this event, but also conceptualizing and making the project of Ambivalent, the book, a reality. but has also done extensive groundwork in establishing visual history as a niche area in the university. And I think in Southern Africa, quite possibly Africa. It was not too long ago that a PhD thesis in the discipline of history that focuses on photography would have even existed. It was unthinkable at some stage. And it's thanks to academics like Patricia that have slowly pushed an academic project that takes images seriously and not merely illustrations. Images as the foundation for theorization and objects to think with critically. And the list of students and postdocs whom she supervised and mentored are evidence of this, and many of them are here. And as a result, visual history as a field, I believe, has grown tremendously as a cutting-edge field of study and discourse community. And I mentioned the journal Chronos earlier. And I think Patricia played a significant role in that journal in encouraging more scholarship centered not only on visual material, but also cultural archives. And time again, I encounter historians from different institutions, locally and abroad, and I'm amazed at how much the discussions that we at UWC in the university take for granted barely exist in other spaces, particularly serious engagement and complex engagement with visuality. And Patricia has, of course, published extensively and has edited several special issues, including in Chronos and Gender and History. And she's also uniquely worked quite closely with photographers, contemporary photographers, including Santo Mofokeng and the recently late John Liebenberg. And in fact, a prominent aspect of her work is writing about specific contemporary photographers in South Africa, but with a lens that takes history seriously. And at the same time, she's also very importantly fostered a network of scholars invested in photography in different institutions on the continent, which is quite rare for academics living in South Africa, particularly South Africans who often will look to Europe and the US and fail to kind of foster networks with scholars on the continent. But also India and US and Europe. And it's really thanks to her that we've had such a fantastic turnout, because I'm pretty sure most of you have never heard of me. And we're here because of Patricia. So at that point, Patricia, I will hand over to you to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Pindi. And I'm sure loads of people have come for you. I'm convinced of that. Thank you. One of the happiest moments for me in the making of this book, Ambivalent, was when, you could suddenly see how its parts spoke to each other across space and time. How in Isabel de Rezende's work, the verbal images from oral delivery in Central Africa might make their way into a 19th century traveler's account, which might later influence colonial figures in the 20th century who think they're contributing to knowledge by making ethnographic photographs, which I talk about in my chapter on empty photographs. Then these photos might make their way out of the museum into rural communities through a researcher like Napandulwa Shiweda in Namibia, who describes the joy with which they are received in the 21st century. Well, there's something that is recognizable here in the image as an old citation that has come home. Often, however, the parts of the book Ambivalent don't speak easily to each other, because for some groups, the image means a great deal. And for example, it drives digital activism, as George Agbo and Okwuchukwu Nwafor suggest in Nigeria, while for others, the image means nothing, like the reaction of survivors of the airborne attack on Namibians at Kasinga in 1978 that Vilho Shigweda talks about, or the ritual experts in Benin who are themselves mediums of other forces in Jungran Forte's chapter. But as we say in the book, these differences should not disturb us. In fact, being different and posing difficulties instead of fitting in has probably been the biggest driving force of this book, I'm happy to say. So I want to start by thanking, I wouldn't say our enemies, but our skeptics, detractors and critics, and those who put obstacles in our way, because it obliged us to work, to think, and to try much harder to get to this point. In the late 1990s, Gary Minkley and myself started a postgraduate module in visual history that Pindy's mentioned, with a handful of remarkable students. We had all become interested in photographic archives and the global theoretical literature around visuality that spoke in very interesting ways to other literatures on African history, on postcoloniality and the post-apartheid that our students were passionate about. We began to think about how in the post-colony, the public image takes the place of this public space. But other images can also make publics, especially during conflict. Then the photograph itself does not capture things as such. It goes beyond the obvious of representation and brings us to the edge of sight, the edge of history, with the frame groaning and creaking to let in more, as Gary Minkley puts it. The University of the Western Cape and our colleagues all unhesitatingly supported the initiative in visual history, also after Gary Minkley relocated to Fort Hare, where Pindi Mnyaka studied. Now, compared with many African universities, UWC and Fort Hare are privileged sites, but as former Black universities in the tertiary landscape of post-apartheid South Africa, they are far from being elite institutions. More students, however, steadily continued to join us, often coming through the African program in Museum and Heritage Studies at UWC, including artists and photographers, until numerous master's and doctoral studies were underway that addressed radical new questions about images, the senses, and the dynamics of structural adjustment, of violence, race, sexuality, collectivities, the self, the unconscious. Our partnerships with other universities abroad brought provocative collaborators who joined us in addressing a worldly debate on photography that puts Africa at the center, helping us also to unsettle narratives of both colonialism and the nation, such as Isabel de Rezende and Drew Thompson working on Congo and Mozambique, respectively. Often our research questions as we engaged with local archives, as Pindi has spoken about so eloquently, they didn't sit easily with existing literature on photography in Africa. And this is where somebody exceptional like Ingrid Masondo comes in, who joined us from the Market Photo Workshop in Johannesburg. Ingrid put the question, what actually were and are the effects of the ID photo in the South African passbook in impressing race visually on its subjects and their onlookers? Now, the effects are so taken for granted as automatically repressive that nobody before Ingrid had examined it. For us generally, this line of questioning added momentum to a growing discomfort with easy binarisms, such as repressive and honorific, with problematic categories of genre and historical periodizations connected to terms like modernity. A point we make in the introduction is that given the colonial past and the imperial present, there are burning questions about who has the right to see in Africa and who has the right to write about seeing. So this is where the impetus comes from, to publish a new generation of scholars with the smarts and the imagination around themes of visibility and ambivalence in relation to a technical medium such as photography. The inspiration to think with ambivalence, of course, comes from the late Santu Mofokeng, photographer. Now, the first publisher we went to with Ambivalent told us to cut chapters and fit in with the predominant literature on photography. We told them, but we want to push the existing literature in new directions, not fit in. So we went to a second publisher, and this is where I want to thank New Africa series editor Jean Allman in particular. She's former president of the African Studies Association, who's not afraid of new brains in Africa. Our manuscript was guided into production by Gillian Berchowitz and her colleagues at Ohio University Press. And Elizabeth has spoken about the quality of this production. We thank you. So those of you in South Africa who want copies, these can be purchased from Andre at Clark's bookstore in Cape Town as the ship has come in. Now, aside from my beautiful co-authors, it remains for me to thank the Center for Humanities Research at UWC for hosting this book launch, the Mellon Foundation for their subvention, the National Research Foundation of South Africa and other funders for their support. Most of all, thinking of our formal and informal research fraternities and connectivities. And having recently lost my co-researcher and friend Laban Natangwe Shapange to COVID a few weeks ago in Namibia, I wish to thank all our interconnected communities, interlocutors, archivists, friends and families who've helped us all so enormously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Really, really appreciate that. We will now open it up for questions and commentary. Please use the reaction button to put your hand up. And Anna Chiara will help me monitor the questions. I'll try my best to make sure I don't leave anyone out, but it is a bit difficult with this kind of platform, but please go ahead if anyone would like to say something, and I'd also like to encourage the contributors who didn't speak to say anything should they wish. If the spirit moves you, as Ingrid apparently said.
It wasn't me who said so, Pindi, it was Patricia.
Oh, okay, okay, sorry.
I just agreed.
Okay, okay. Thanks, Ingrid. Colleagues, am I missing something? I'm not seeing any hands or anything like that. And just keep in mind that you are muted in case you start speaking. And
I have a question.
Go ahead.
For Drew Thompson, it's kind of silly, but like, how did the terminology ship photos kind of been used to ascribe these pictures?
Yeah, I think in terms of the provocation by the authors, the co-editors and other contributors, we were thinking about other terminologies around which to capture photography's complex practice. And in some ways, the term itself came from the photographer, Kok Nam, in a way that seeks to sort of clarify what the role of the photographer is versus the one who develops the films. And so ship photos really became a way of categorizing another practice or series of images that tend to be discarded from what we traditionally see as studio or commercial photography. And here I'm just trying to work around the fact that Malik Sidibe and other West African studio photographers are generally seen as reference points for studio photography. And we'll ask the question, what happens when there are other practices that don't fit into that?
Okay. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Lauren.
Can I ask a question of the panelists, I guess? What comes next for everyone after this book? Or, you know, we made contributions that incredibly allowed us to showcase our work. And I guess I'm interested in hearing from each of the panelists how their thinking or framing of photography has shifted, yourself included, Pindi, to think about what do we do with this work now that it's in existence, either in terms of your own specific research areas or the projects that are to follow as a result or made possible by this.
Maybe I can say something, not so much in terms of the afterlife of the book, but because that almost, if I say that, it almost implies that it's ended. But for me, it's actually opened up a whole other field, because my chapter focuses specifically on beach photos in East London. And while that paper was in the making, I presented a draft of it at Wits University at a workshop. And there I met the scholar Isabel Hofmeyr. And then after that, she invited me to be part of this Oceanic Humanities group. And at the time, I didn't think of that imagery in terms of kind of oceanic humanities, even though it's about the beach. I just didn't, it never crossed my mind. And that was wonderfully productive, because then that invitation led me to become part of, to actually start engaging with brand new literature on oceanic humanities, and to think about photography from the viewpoint of water and the ocean, etc. And what's happened as a result is that even though for a while I was cringing at my dissertation, I was like, oh, I never want to see this again, I've ended up going back to some of my doctoral material, not the thesis itself, but the archival material, and thinking about it through a fresh lens. So for example, I looked at this, you know, quote unquote colonial photographer, Joseph Denfield. It would be easy to just write about him as just a white, you know, English photographer representing, you know, Africans in a particular way. And that's a set, we know that critique. I mean, who cares? But when I look at his material, which is strongly photographic through the lens of an oceanic humanities, I can keep at the back of my mind his own intentions, which may or may not have been racist, but actually thinking about the material through the lens of ambivalence and through the lens of the ocean actually has generated other ideas for me. So for me, that particular paper in the book has it's just one article, but it's actually opened up a whole world for me, which was needed. So, and that's, which in turn has then even shaped my own writing, like the way I write, just experimenting with form and whatnot. So, but I can only speak for myself, but if the others would like to say something. And I know Catherine had a question, I know I saw that, so. Kathy, would you like to say something?
Sure, but it's on a different topic than the one you've just asked your fellow authors to respond to, Pindi. Let's just wait a minute. They might want to say something, and then I'm happy to come in.
Okay.
Okay, hello, can I say something? Yeah, I think, Drew, you raised a very important point. It goes back to UWC when I was about to complete my PhD. One Nigerian friend, Jeremiah Rowoshebe, after listening to me presenting every time on Ashwebi, he came to me one day and said, Okwuchukwu, after Ashwebi, what next? That was the question Jeremiah asked me. And since that time, I started thinking about my scholarship and the direction that my scholarship will take after Ashwebi. And that was how I now started looking at a new kind of photographic practice, or practices that are happening in Nigeria, which is the social media. I started working on photography in funeral and burial ceremonies in southeastern Nigeria. Although since then I have been struggling to see how I can publish the work that I have generated from this research. But unfortunately, all the journals I have been sending the work have been turning it down because it seems the work is out of place. But I am not giving up because I am still working to see how I can get those works published. So this is a new idea that I have started, and there are a lot of things happening in photography, in funeral, in burial ceremonies in Nigeria, which I believe one can actually explore and come up with a whole lot of theoretical direction, a new theoretical direction in African photography. Thank you.
Thanks, okay. And I just want to say there's a comment from Nancy Rose who says that as former UM person, Duke University Press's Theory Informed series may well like to publish your books, visual or otherwise, just contact me. And she's left her email address there. So thanks for that. Kathy, over to you.
Oh, that was wonderful seeing Nancy do that. And yeah, Okwuchukwu will no doubt be sending an email to her in about 17 minutes or something. Anyway, that was just so wonderful. And I congratulate all of you authors. It's so exciting. But I wanted to ask a slightly strange question, I think, because I've been teaching so much the last couple of months and using all of these new digital materials, or they're new to me. I have really noticed the way that people in places like Johannesburg are thinking about the visual more than maybe we have. We've lagged way behind the University of the Western Cape in so many ways. And so I was wondering if all of you could speak, both people that were graduate students around that fantastic department and the lecturers and professors, because I don't know if there'd be that many undergraduates in the Zoom, about the iterative process of the visual history undergraduate courses and then of course the outstanding graduate courses, and the way that the work of pedagogy and of the inspiration that bubbled up from those students over all the years, the essays that they wrote, which were profoundly shaped by their own responses to the ambivalent in the visual archive, and the way that they unpack that in their work, in their mini dissertations. I never got to read, and I haven't read the PhDs, but I've got to read the third years and the fourth and fifth years. And over that time, I've had this enormous sense of an omnibus project underway, of a multi-connected project. And so I'm asking about whether and how teaching using these theoretical tools and the visual has shaped this enormous theoretical research production. It's another way of saying, in a teaching heavy environment like the University of the Western Cape, with students who come to the subject of the past with very complex knowledge of their own, and who then approach all sorts of complicated texts, is this is that part of your process? Particularly, I'm thinking here of people like Patricia and Pindi and Gary, but also others. How has that fed and nourished the research part of this and the final product itself?
Patricia, I think you really should respond to that.
Oh my goodness, Kathy, what a huge question. Firstly, to say that I think, with this year and the big shift to online, I think in a way, many of us are at sea, but that liquidity is actually a very productive space. I have to say that having worked with lots of images in the classroom and realizing how quickly people pick up visual literacy, and seemingly as that happens, a lot of students also pick up a fluency in theoretical literacy, if you like, somehow conceptualizing articulating concepts and being comfortable with theory seems to come with, you know, familiarity and being comfortable and I mean, it's such a common place to say images are ubiquitous and so on. But while that's the case, and we're in a digital time when this is very much so, I think a lot of the present generation don't think critically about those images. And so it's a wonderful sudden kind of spark when you can shift some of those questions into the different parameters. So I'll stop there. I'd be really interested to hear what other colleagues and graduate students have to say about this. Thanks.
I think we have several graduate students actually on the platform, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if anyone would like to sort of say something, who's been part of Ingrid, maybe, I think there's several, maybe Rui, yeah, please go ahead. Goyelo, I see, is online as well.
Actually, sorry, Pindi, can I say something else?
Of course. Which
I wanted to say earlier, but I didn't really have a chance to. Sorry, I'm barging in again.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
Just to talk about something else very important, which is that for those of us who are in academic positions and, you know, are this, you know, supposed, the ones who are supposed to impart knowledge, I must say that what I have learned from my own graduate students who work in these archives with these extraordinary questions has totally destabilized a lot of my thinking and helped me to reconfigure a lot of the ways I think about the historical discipline in particular. And so I just want to mention a few, you know, Pindi, your work has been so important in showing what can happen when you take a leap into thinking about writing and turning to that focus again after being immersed in questions of images and art. And when I think about our other PhD recently graduated, Rui Asabuji from Mozambique, and his incredibly painstaking work in the Portuguese colonial archives, which you would think would be an unappealing and unattractive task, but he has turned it into something extraordinary and done his own preservation work of very precious, precarious resources as he did so. So I want to pay a special tribute to what I have learned from all of you, from our amazing students who came to us from Nigeria, Okwuchukwu and George, who finished in record time and went lickety-split through the literature and continued to generate enormous creativity. All I can say to OK is you must hang in there and you're going to find a home for your writing. So don't despair. Thank you.
Sorry, Elizabeth, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to follow on from what Patricia's just said and say more generally, I think those of us who have been on this path for some while owe an enormous debt to their students, because in many ways we were in an experimental space and we were learning together. You know, one was supervising PhDs on a track that you had no idea where it was going to go because the methodologies weren't in place, the philosophy wasn't in place, everything was being pieced together, and it was a wonderful space of debate. And I think one of the great things about Ambivalent is you begin to see the fruits of those debates in the way that Patricia's just described. And I think, you know, a lot of us have suffered a sort of sense of marginalization in our disciplines because of our what is seen as a sort of idiot track that we persisted on having. I mean, this is quite a funny story. I won't name names, but a departmental secretary came back to me one day. There'd been a departmental meeting of which I had not attended because I have better things to do with my life. And she rang me up and said, "You're going to love this. It had been suggested that I took on some sort of task." And one of the old guards sniffed and said, "Oh no, we can't have that. She pollutes the purity of the discipline," which I think is one of the nicest things anyone's ever said about me. I'm so pleased. So I think we should all go on polluting the purity of the disciplines.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think I just want to sort of go back to Okay's point about publishing, and also Patricia, you know, the kind of anecdote around the frustration of publishing. And I do want to say, I mean, it's a huge source of anxiety, and we're all aware of the kind of questions of decolonizing universities, whereas I still think actually, you know, the people who have so much power are the publishers. You know, we're not kind of protesting against them. So I think I would like to urge, because of the people who are in this pool, in this meeting, if you are in a position where you have some influence in terms of being able to accept a monograph that's excellent but pushes boundaries, I would actually urge you to kind of use that power, because otherwise the same knowledge will be generated about Africa, you know, whether it's by African scholars or European scholars, it doesn't even matter, and then nothing will change. And I think it's important to actually, for those people who are in positions to accept manuscripts or reject manuscripts, or even at the level of being a peer reviewer, you know, even at that level, to just ask yourself, am I expecting this person to be fitting into a particular way of writing about photographs of Africa? So I'd like to urge us to actually use our whatever power you have to change something about the world of publishing, because otherwise nothing's gonna change. You know, that's my 2 minutes. Okay. Any other sort of, we have about 8 minutes left or so. So anyone who would like to sort of share their thoughts, feelings, questions? There was a question from Jeremy much earlier, which was about whether this is available in Namibia. I don't know if, I can't answer that. So how would a person in Namibia access the book? Any idea, Patricia?
So Pindi, the original plan was that we were very ambitious and optimistic, and we were going to have a book launch in Cape Town. We were going to have a book launch in Windhoek. We were going to have a book launch in East London. So we are going to have to arrange for some books to go up to Namibia, which we will do. We'll talk to Clark's, Jeremy. So maybe you should let us know how many would be helpful. I have to say that unfortunately we don't have a co-publisher in Southern Africa. It's a standalone book with New Africa series. So we're going to have to, you know, be quite proactive and help each other a little bit in making it accessible also in Nigeria, hopefully Mozambique and elsewhere. Yeah, thanks.
Siraj has a question, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, one of the very productive things that we were able to do a couple of years ago with colleagues at the University of Michigan in the case of the book that the collaborative book that we did, edited by Derek Peterson, Kojo Gavua, and myself, is we got it into the system that Cambridge University Press had for a while of publishing a certain number of softcover versions of the book for African distribution. And by that, of course, they meant sub-Saharan Africa, all of the problems with that, because they have a department of sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean in the Organization of the World. And because through a subvention, we were able to get that book sold on the African continent for $12 US. The second thing that was very important for us through the involvement of the kind of institutional arrangements of the publications, we were able to make sure that that book went into important libraries and museum collections on the continent. So, you know, one has to have that kind of strategy, and it's very difficult to interfere with the work that publishers do in their usual ways of distributing books. And obviously, we would like to think that a book like this should have a life outside of the academic classroom and outside of the kind of circles of academics. And I think it's something that we really need to continue to think about.
Thanks, Raj. Thanks very much. I've been trying to monitor the chat to see if there's any questions that I've missed or comments. Person, you can just start speaking, to be honest. Feel free at this stage. And just keep in mind, you are muted in case you're speaking and we can't.
Pindi, can I speak?
Of course.
I want to say, first of all, this has been fantastic, and I've ordered my book and I look forward to it. And, you know, just if there's any more remarks on what kind of departures, I did sort of minuted you this text briefly, but what kind of departures theoretically about how photography works, if you could just maybe, if anybody could just maybe pin down that or remark further on that as a sort of prequel to my actually reading the material. I don't know if that's too vague or not.
Paul, do you mind repeating that question, actually?
So what kinds of theoretical departures we expect from the much delayed and finally more available set of student and post-student voices coming out of Africa? That's the significance that has been underlined in one part. And it's not like this has never happened before, but in terms of this book, destabilizing the kinds of models that have already been there, can anyone maybe just sort of say a teeny bit more about that destabilization and how that works?
Indeed, I can try to put a few things on the table. Thank you, Paul. Of course, you ask the toughest questions. We rely on you for that. And you know, you're somebody that we read also who inspired us with, you know, introducing different kinds of literature to our thinking. So we always owe you a debt, Paul. Thank you. I think that what's quite striking about, if I think about the chapters in Ambivalent and the theses that people were working on and where they're going with it now, I think there's a kind of confidence to liberate oneself from kind of tracking phases in literature, in debates, and trying to work out where you might fit into that. I think that there's been quite a sort of throwing of many balls into the air. I think what Drew is saying about new genre categories come from listening to actual photographers on the ground, and working with different ideas. So he's got his shit photos, which is a phrase from Cocknam, putting amateur photographers in a certain hierarchy. But I came up with the category of empty photographs. And I must say I was greatly encouraged by some of my friends and colleagues in India to sort of throw everything to the winds and try to work with unexpected categories instead, because they just were so sclerotic. If you stay with the category of ethnographic photography and you go into a university classroom and you try to interest students in Southern Africa to go and research that as ethnographic, it's so problematic. If you can find another entry point into that. So one of the things we've been doing with the chair in visual history and theory is having these annual workshops where we invite different thinkers to come and present their work to us. Sadly, we've never had Elizabeth come. I wish we could rectify this and bring you on a ship. But we've had Krista Thompson, and I can see some of the impact of the debates she's involved in around shine and digital glamour, being picked up with Okwuchukwu and worked into his own ideas in a really interesting way. Jennifer Tucker came and gave a keynote lecture here a few years ago where she gave a most exciting talk about the Industrial Revolution and its representation in images. And, for us to have the immediacy of being able to engage people directly and then put our little questions about our weird industrial processes in Southern Africa, it actually really starts to shift things and they sort of break down. I found it really interesting to put photographic images together in conversation with other so-called sources, and it starts to make it really it demystifies how these things are constituted in themselves. And you need to ask the same set of questions about, oral tradition, text, film, photography. Goodness me. Another thing to say is that, a special word here for Wilho Shikweda in Namibia, whose work is so original, who was so tuned to his interlocutors in his study of the survivors of the Kasinga massacre of 1978. And he again worked with the concepts that they gave him. So he came with this notion of the nothing photograph, which was what one of the women he spoke to told him as her response to a very famous photograph that was responsible for mobilizing solidarity. Now, what the implication is, you realize very quickly, is that he's actually challenging, the corpus of theory of somebody like Ariella Azoulay and the civil contract of photography, because people are not willing to subscribe to the citizenship of photography in the ways that are presumed from where she was writing. So one can't just automatically apply concepts and distribute that theory into another case study, as someone said earlier. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And I think I just want to add by saying that I think what I took when I read the book as a whole is that actually, we have to let these photographs keep us on our methodological and theoretical toes all the time, both kind of past images, but also whatever may be emerging now, rather than sit comfortably and feel as though, we are reading them. In some ways, they also shaping us. So I think it's that kind of sitting uncomfortably. And I see, speaking of comfort, is that we are out of time, unfortunately, colleagues. I can't express enough how happy I am to see so many people's names and faces. And those of you who kept your video on, thank you for doing that, because it's so nice. In this time of hyper-isolation, it's so lovely to actually see faces. I attended a workshop recently, which was water-themed, and it was on Zoom. And because we couldn't meet in person, the organizers sent each of us a bottle of wine. If I could, I would have done that to all of you. So I do want to send, I'm just say a very, very, very special thank you for taking the time, for listening, and for your comments and your congratulations. They mean a lot to all of us. And before we all disappear, I just want to double check that there isn't anyone with a burning question or anything or statement that they'd like to make before we say farewell, because part of me doesn't want to say farewell actually. So but I understand people need to leave. Yeah.
Lucky Elizabeth wanted to say something.
Oh, I think Rituli had a question. Sorry, Rituli.
Yeah, George.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Thanks. I'm very delighted to be here, and I thank all of you for your presentations. I just want to express a worry, something that I keep thinking about. This idea of excess of the image. If you look at what is happening in Nigeria now, all the youth are on the street protesting that SARS should end. SARS is the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, a unit of the Nigerian police. So it has climaxed in a very, very broad protest across the country. And the images generated online, especially on Facebook and WhatsApp, emerging from these protests. There are many, there are very many, and they're just becoming too much. So how would one deal with that kind of excess? That's literally meaning of excess. So it's just a worry that I want somebody to talk to me about that.
Yeah, George.
Yeah.
Just a comment. I think what you have just said is something I think you have been working on in a different way, because and I think you should continue with that. But having said that, I think what is happening in Nigeria is something that has to do with technology, with digital technology, and the kind of revolution that digital technology is causing in the African continent. And this is very provocative. And I think it is time we all begin to look at it more deeply. You see, I was discussing with where I went to buy some foods in a local market here. And the lady that sells the food saw my Infinix Hot 9, and she told me that she has Infinix Note 5, that she wants to upgrade to Infinix Hot 9, but that she doesn't have the money to do that. And I asked her why, And she said that the camera of Infinix Hot 9 is better than Infinix Note 5. And you can understand when I was thinking about something that has to do with photography, when she was complaining that the reason why she wanted to upgrade to Infinix Hot 9 is because of the camera. She said that the camera is very powerful, and you could see how digital technology is playing out in everyday life in the African continent. So this is something that is very interesting and something that I'm also interested in looking at. And I think we all are also doing that in some ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, George and OK, for reminding us that, in fact, there is this backdrop, and it's not even really a backdrop in your lives, of what's happening in Nigeria and the significance of visuality and digitality as part of the struggle. I just got a note. Rituli, did you have a question? I just want to... I can't hear you. Struggling to hear you. I still can't hear you. Okay. Maybe you can just type your comment on the chat. Okay, that's fine. Okay, we'll leave it. Okay. So I think, colleagues, as much as I'd like to hold on to you, and I really could for the rest of the evening, I will have to release you, and hopefully we will encounter each other, whether in this particular platform or in real life, as the world changes and we live with uncertainties. So special thank you to Elizabeth for taking the time. It really has been fantastic to have you. And thank you to Drew, and thank you to OK, and very, very special thank you to Patricia and to CHR for helping us and with all the technical assistance. These things can be a bit stressful. And I'm just so happy that my internet did not let me down. So, so thank you, everyone. I'm going to be the last to leave in case anyone wants to say anything to me or whatever. But have a wonderful evening. Please keep in touch. Order the book. It's beautiful to look at. Actually, it's visually pleasing. That's another thing, and wonderful to read. So thank you, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
I will also be the last to leave.
Okay.
The bitter enders.
The bitter.
The cover photo is from Pindi's work.
Oh, yes. Okay.
There's a question of Jeremy.
Yes, I see there's a Jeremy. How can you have a question, such a detailed question right at the end?
All right.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, quite complex.
I think that's a good thing. I was just thinking
Sorry?
about what way you made me think. I mean, the whole conversation is, that's great that it's made me think. So I'm going to get the book and read and think more about this issue. But just because of with our work with a lot with photographs that are another type of photograph, which is these photographs which are images of collections of artifacts removed from Namibia. And so we're working with communities, but often, I mean, yeah, always actually with photographs of the objects that are absent. So I need to read the book and think more about this. So thank you for making me think.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeremy.
Can I just say something in reply to Jeremy? Jeremy, isn't there another aspect to this, which is also that there are photograph collections in European museums, which are are also in question. So it's not just about a photographic record of an object and whether that's a satisfactory repatriation. I mean, there are massive photographic collections that are haunting the basements and libraries of Europe. I think that's a really interesting question that it would be really productive to think more about. So if you could just invite us to a nice workshop in Windhoek and we'll...
Of course, what concerns us working with exhibitions as well is how many photographs are being, behind commercial barriers now. So you actually can sometimes track down very important historical photographs that have been bought up by big American stock. I don't know what the correct name is, but so the photographs are there but not there for us to use.
If I could just say, Jeremy, one interesting development is that the Portuguese are doing a great deal of digitization, and some of it is very valuable material that it's worth looking at. So I'd really love to have a chat with you about some of that, because it includes some of the areas I know that you're very intimately involved with on the border between Angola and Namibia.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, and I think this is a conversation that must go on afterwards.
Okay.
I don't quite know what to do at this stage. I kind of assumed that people would quickly log off. And then...
Give us wine, Pindi, give us wine. We're waiting for wine.
I would love to give you wine, but I can't.
The book launch always has an after party.
Yeah, I mean, this is the time. I think it's so ingrained in our bodies that, you have a discussion and then you're supposed to have a glass of wine with snacks. So
yeah, it's a spreader event.
Yes. To now have to think about dinner and etc. is quite an anticlimax. Yeah.
I think we should all go and have a glass of wine.
Yes, but I wanted to say, to add to your question, so Jeremy, about the repatriation and restitution. I think that in this discussion, we often don't talk about local museums and galleries, and it's usually in relation to other spaces, US, Europe, or whatever. We talk about repatriation, but not focusing on what the local institutions have done to local communities. And I think the conversation needs to go there too. That was my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I should say, I mean, our experience with images with local communities is very much, it's provoked discussions about cultural revival and discussions about past practices and an intergenerational knowledge exchange between people who, with younger generations, with objects whose names are, let me say, forgotten or not, haven't been passed on to the younger generation. So it's creating a space, actually. So even in the absence of the objects, the images of the objects, even just that is provoking a discussion, which is very interesting.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Lovely to see you. Bye.
Yeah, bye. Yeah.
Bye.
Napandilwe, nice to have you here. You was quiet.
Pindi.
Hi.
Hi, my dear. Sorry, I was busy printing stuff. So I couldn't really. I have logged out, but I'm walking all over the place. It was really nice. So I was listening in. I put the thingy on And it's hot.
Is the university open?
We are at the office, so
okay.
I mean, yeah. I was just printing stuff because I have to finish marking this weekend.
Okay.
In Libya, we are back to having 200 people in this space.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So we can meet.
Oh wow, okay.
Bye, Pindi.
Bye. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much. Okay, I think, colleagues,
Okay, bye,
I think.
Pindi. Bye, Patricia.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Jeremy.
Oh, Jeremy, it's hard to say goodbye.
No,
Yeah.
bye.